wants to trickle in. So yeah, today we have with us Dr. Rachel Brenner. She's currently a professor here at CSU doing clinical and counseling psychology. And then today we have kind of, I guess, an overview of her research that she's going to talk about and some of the things that she studies. So primarily her research focuses on distress and then how that can affect people physically and mentally. So we're going to go into that. And then afterwards, we should have some time for questions.
Great. Okay. So it said, let me see why the screen, hold on a second. It said the screen share failed, but let me try again. Okay, can you all see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I thought so to what actually, Dr. Gingrich, did I get that? Yes,
You did.
I realized I'm not sure if you went to my job talk. This one's really similar. But my thought with today is to, like you said, Emily, thanks for that introduction, to talk about my research program a little bit and walk you through some of the research that I'm doing and future directions that I plan to go in. I started my PhD in 2012, and since then, the conversation around culture and identity and health disparities has accelerated quite a bit, and so there was really a progression in my own the values and priorities that I placed around my research. When I started this research, I didn't, when I started grad school, that I cared about these things, but it wasn't something that felt central to my research identity. And so as you'll see in the studies that I talk about today, they start out not related to health disparities. And now I'm moving in a direction to integrate those in a way that does really bring us to help understand the disparities and reduce them. And actually so this is a little bit like my job talk, which I figured if anyone's interested in academics, you might see a little bit of what that's like. I started out my job talk with a story of when I had just moved to Albany a few years ago, and it was a hot summer day and I wanted to get some ice cream. And so I walked, I lived in a great neighborhood with a bunch of shops, and I walked into Ben and Jerry's. And as I was standing in line, I noticed that the cups with the pens, back in the days when there was just one cup, not the clean, sanitized, if you can remember that world. And there was a pride flag in the Ben and Jerry's cup, or in the cup with the pens, and I immediately felt myself relax and almost let out like a sigh of relief. So I identify as queer, and I didn't even notice that I had been tense in the first place. And it really had me thinking about, how much I and people with marginalized identities walk around with some level of hypervigilance. And that was one small way that clearly physically I'd been operating differently until I saw it was a safe space. And so we're really just starting to scratch the surface of health disparities and how holding different identities in the societies that we live in impacts our health. And so I'm excited to talk with you a little bit about some of the work that I'm hoping to do and that kind of progression, starting with things that are not directly related to health disparities, but will get us there. So my research program covers kind of three areas. So how does the world treat us? So what it is the stigma, the stigmatic views that society holds towards us for different reasons, identities that we hold, what norms are we told to adhere to, what discrimination do people from different groups experience, for example, and then how do we respond to that? Do we engage in practices like self-compassion, or are we self-critical? Do we internalize that stigma and discrimination and apply to ourselves? Do we seek psychological help? And then the next step, which is where I'm moving in the future, is then how does this relate to health disparities in physical health and mental health, and also a big one I am interested in is sleep, which is viewed as an aspect of physical health while also being a predictor of other aspects of physical health at the same time. So the self-compassion and help seeking and discrimination and sleep kind of all come together to make up my research program. So we're going to talk about each of those today. So first, self-compassion. I'm trying trying to change how you all are showing up on my screen. I like want to see your faces, but okay. Okay, so we all have moments where we fail in some way, where we miss the mark. Maybe we experience anxiety with public speaking. Maybe we struggle with test anxiety, or maybe it's not that we failed, but that others are ostracizing or excluding us for some reason or telling us that we've done something wrong. Self-compassion is one way that we can respond in these moments. So self-compassion is one way to respond when we feel inadequate or like we have failed in some way. And so self-compassion is made up of several different facets. One is self-kindness, so being kind to ourselves. And there are a couple others of this kind of positive component of self-compassion that is more Eastern. So self-compassion in general is influenced. It's the research itself is derived from Buddhist philosophy and culture. So there's also this element of common humanity, which is connecting with the ubiquity, with the universalness of human suffering. So rather than saying I'm alone, I'm the only one who feels this way, knowing that there are other people who are suffering. And then mindfulness, which Dr. Kristen Neff, who really started this whole area of research around 2003, the way that she uses mindfulness, because it's discussed, and there are many different components of mindfulness, but what she talks about is being aware of the world, like physical mindfulness of being aware of the world around us outside of our internal experience. And so the self-kindness then is the opposite of self-judgment, which is what it sounds like, being judgmental towards ourselves. And then the opposite of common humanity is that isolation. No one understands me. I'm the only one who has experienced this type of pain. And then over-identification is opposite of mindfulness. And so that's this idea of, instead of connecting with the world outside of us as part of our experience, over-identification is when we over-identify with our pain and see it as like a big part of who we are. And so those are the kind of the opposite counterparts. So this was used to create the self-compassion scale. And since 2003, it's been linked with a greater self-compassion is linked with less of all these negative, distressing symptoms and greater life satisfaction, happiness, relationships. And so meta-analyses and people have summarized this as overall self-compassion is linked with lower distress and greater well-being. And when I say meta-analysis, that's essentially a study that studies other studies and summarizes them all and says, here's this effect. So this is pretty much saying, wow, like self-compassion, that's a big deal. And so it's taken off since 2003, and that's Dr. Neff giving a TEDx talk. Self-compassion has become an area of focus in the counseling and clinical world, and it's become this really popular area. However, there are what we call psychometric and theoretical concerns. So what psychometric means pretty much the measurement aspect. When we have a measure, we can't just say, oh, I created 10 items and I say they're depression and so they're depression. Well, how do we know that that's what's being measured? And so the to go through the jargon, essentially the self-compassion scale was originally viewed as this one factor measure. And so with those 6 components I talked about, the 3 negative ones were reverse scored. But then when they looked and did some fancy stats, looking more closely, didn't find support for that, and in fact suggested that there might be 2 factors. But that had been looked at, and they referring to self-compassion and self-coldness. Self-coldness being those negative components. However, at that point, those were translated versions, which when you translate measures, that also can mess the validity a little bit potentially. And so I conducted a study where I looked at the self-compassion scale. And when I say theoretical concerns, that's also that the reason that theory comes into play is that a measure should represent the construct beneath the items. So, and that we should score things how they exist in reality. For example, if you had a measure of, if you had 20 items that measured 10 measured depression and 10 measured anxiety, well, if you create a total score of all of those, then what is that? So it's important to know actually what factors are present and how do you calculate them when we look at them in research. And so you don't need to know what any of these stats mean. I kept this slide in here just to impress you with the confusion. But ultimately, I compared a series of different types of 1 and 2 factor models where we looked at people's responses to this scale. And essentially, the one thing I'll say is that here, you can see my mouse when I move it, right? Because it's screen share. Yeah. So these are different pairs of 1 and 2 factor scales, and you want this number to be higher than 0.95. And in all of these, the 2 factor was better. And it's not the only metric, but it's one of them, goes to show that ultimately, and there are other pieces of fancy stats that I'm not going to get into because that's not the point of this, that really pointed to the 2 factor measure being a better fit. And there's this one way of looking at the scale specifically, but ultimately the piece that's important is that, oh, wait a second, there are two scales, but what is the theory underneath that? So what researchers have used is this in discussing this debate is the theory of social mentalities, which is this idea that we have different thoughts and behaviors and emotional responses to the world around us based on whether or not we feel threatened or safe. And so there are these systems that mirror the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So this threat defense system is activated when we feel like our environment is unsafe or threatening in some way. And so when that system is activated, our goal is to decrease threat. And so we might defend ourselves, we might isolate from other people because we might not view our environment as safe. And then on the flip side, connected with the parasympathetic nervous system is the safeness system. So whereas the threat to defense system is designed to like protect us and decrease threat, the safeness system is activated when we feel safe, and that's designed to promote our well-being. And so we, rather than push away from the world around us, engage with the world around us. And so we like seeking support from other people or cultivating relationships. So there's an openness to the environment around us and a seeking of connection. And so a byproduct of this, even though it's really focused originally on the world around us, is that it also impacts the ways that we treat ourselves. And so we can actually come to view ourselves as a threat, right? If you fail at something or you don't do well on a test, then that feeling of threat activating that system, then you might view yourself as the reason and start being critical. And so you can develop what they call this hostile self-to-self relationship, which we refer to as self-coldness, whereas the safeness system then elicits these calming, self-soothing messages to ourselves, just like we're more likely to be kind and trusting of the people around us, being kind and trusting internally. And so that then has been thought to be connected to self-compassion. And so that's part of why when we look at the way that people respond to these items, there are these different patterns of responses, and that's likely one thought is that it's representative of the fact that we have these two systems that operate differently from each other. So now this whole time we've been calculating the self-compassion score by taking those negative items and reverse scoring them. So half of that score of self-compassion had used self-coldness. And so that left the question of, okay, but what actually are the values of these relationships? Because we've been calculating them with a measure that combines two constructs. And so then another study that I did looked at the relationships of self-compassion and self-coldness with well-being and distress. And I won't actually walk you through all the individual hypotheses. I'll just show you the results, but I'll just say in some, because the safeness system is designed to promote well-being, whereas the threat defense system is designed to address distress. Although in this case, with internal, you're the one being attacked. It was thought that self-compassion is ultimately more strongly related to well-being, and self-coldness is more strongly related to distress. And so that's what we were looking for, like what's the magnitude of these relationships? And then we looked at this thing called an interaction, which I'll tell you about a little bit later. So and maybe even what so we looked at this across two samples, and so use self-compassion and self-coldness to measure self-compassion and self-coldness from those half of the items from the self-compassion scale, the positive and the negative. And then for well-being, created like almost a mega well-being measure using different aspects of well-being in this thing called creating a latent variable, which you don't need to know what that means, but just know that it's this way of kind of extracting the things that these have in common. And so we're saying, okay, this is well-being, and we've just measured it in so many different ways. And then did a similar thing for distress. And so okay, so what I found, and I try to highlight some lines to walk you through the results a bit. So as predicted, so self-compassion was more strongly related to well-being than it was related to distress. And similarly, self-coldness was more strongly related to distress than it was related to well-being. And I actually was able to statistically compare the strengths of these relationships, and then also found that self-coldness was more strongly related to distress than self-compassion. And also is really interesting is that this relationship was not even significant, which we'll come back to in a moment. And then the one thing that contradicted the predictions or didn't quite align was just that the self-compassion and self-coldness were equally related to well-being. And I should say the only difference, of course, being the direction of the relationship. So self-coldness decreased well-being, self-compassion increased well-being, but the absolute values were similar. So the strength of that impact of that relationship, I should say, was about the same. And then also looked at an interaction, essentially looked at, okay, well, is the strength, let's say, of the relationship between self-coldness and distress different based on your self-compassion? And what I found was that yes, so self-compassion for people who reported higher self-compassion, this relationship was weaker than those who had lower self-compassion. So what does that all mean? So first, the findings were mostly consistent with this theory of social mentalities, which would say, okay, these self-coldness would be more strongly linked with distress and self-compassion with well-being. And it also, that non-significant finding with self-compassion is really important and interesting, at least to me, because this whole time we've been saying that it has this big impact on distress. And we know that it does because we've done intervention research. However, it seems like the change that ultimately what's causing the distress in the first place is likely the self-coldness. And that while, so self-compassion, it did not directly link to less distress, but it moderated that relationship or buffered it. So in other words, it weakened the impact of self-coldness. And so in a way, the study said, yes, self-compassion is still important, but it helped us to understand how it works, how it could work. And so in the future also, so that it's still an important intervention point. And that also opens the door to saying, well, are there other things that can interrupt that self-judgment, that isolation, that over-identification? So then future directions, which I'll say touch now, but it fits into some of the discrimination stuff I'll talk about later, is to, first of all, and a big limitation is that the samples were predominantly white and heterosexual cisgender participants, and so wanting to look at that with diverse populations, folks from marginalized backgrounds, looking at health outcomes, and looking to see, are there don't worry about the word mediators, but pretty much looking at this within the context of health, which we'll talk about. So now we're going to shift over to help seeking. So another area of my research is that people don't seek help when they need it, right? So 1 in 5 adults have some type of mental health concern, but less than 10% utilized therapy within the past year, at least in 2017. And we see help seeking disparities among many groups, men, veterans, and racial minorities in particular, with men and veterans also being like quite high. And so researchers have asked, why do these disparities exist? And so stigma has been a big focus of research. So this, and stigma is defined as a mark of shame that's associated with a condition or a characteristic. So seeking help, being help could be considered a characteristic. And so I want to talk about modified labeling theory, which asserts that we have this awareness of public stigma or external societally held stigma, in this case towards people who seek help, and we internalize that as self-stigma. As in, so for example, so self-stigma would be, I feel inadequate for seeking help, versus someone else thinking that you're weak. I think that I'm weak for seeking help. And we find that self-stigma is then linked to worse help-seeking outcomes, like worse attitudes, lower intention to seek help if you are distressed, less actual help seeking. And this type, even though this modified labeling theory is discussed within the context of help seeking and also mental illness, stigma towards having a mental illness or mental health concern, this model really, you see this set in different ways across the board. For example, with sexual minorities, when we talk about internalized heterosexism, also discusses internalized homophobia, this idea that the views that society has towards sexual minorities could be internalized. And I know for myself, I always, even before I had any awareness of my own sexuality, thought that the fact that marriage equality wasn't the law of the land was just like utterly illogical and ridiculous. But then when I started to realize that that identity could apply to me, I was really resistant. Like it was okay for everyone else, but it wasn't okay for me. And that's because of that internalization process. But back to the help seeking realm. So, but then because the self-stigma predicts outcomes so much more strongly than that societal stigma, that's become this big area of focus among researchers. So some of the work that I've done with my colleagues is looking at, can we buffer this impact, this internalization? And so one study that we did looked at self-compassion as something that weakened that relationship between public stigma and self-stigma. And that's what we found, is that for people with higher self-compassion, that the relationship between public stigma and self-stigma was much weaker. So now thinking of disparities a bit, and men and masculinity, I think this photo does a nice job of illustrating. This was, I think, during the storm in I was going to say the storm in Texas, but now we've had like several of those. So I think it was Harvey. And afterwards, this man alone in a canoe, not getting help from anyone, speaks to the, just kind of captures masculinity in a picture. And so part of the reason why men are less likely to seek help than women is because they tend to have more self-stigma. And so there's research asserting that societal norms that are expecting men to be self-reliant and I'll show you that, being self-reliant, having control of their emotions, that those contradict the act of seeking help. And so there's been this robust relationship between masculinity being linked to greater self-stigma. And so we also looked at that with men. Although I want to look at this with women. I came from a lab of men and masculinities, and it's, as a side rant, we need to look at this with women because there are a lot of women who adhere to masculine norms like self-reliance, but that's soapboxes for another talk. And so what we found was that those with higher, so this is higher self-compassion and lower self-compassion, and this is high and low masculinity. So for those who had lower conformity to masculine norms, self-compassion didn't make as much of a difference. But for those with higher reported adherence to masculine norms, the self-stigma was significantly greater for those who were on the lower end of self-compassion. And so this is a particularly important finding because really this is the population we're most concerned about, because those who adhere to masculine norms are less likely to seek help when they need it. And that's also important for with men who are pretty much taught the only negative emotion they're allowed to express is anger. And in a way, I think about this work too as helping people of other identities because of the dangers that come with when you have men who don't process their emotions and operate with high anger. So some future directions with this is looking at self-compassion interventions and looking at this longitudinally over time. And I also want to be more culturally inclusive. So right now I'm developing a scale across 8 countries looking at this other type of help-seeking stigma, because it's a very individualistic lens, because it's all about us. And so this idea of it would bring shame to my family if I sought help, or my parents would be seen as incompetent. So this collective cultural component of it's not just about me, but the shame that I would bring to my family. And doing more research with those from collectivist backgrounds, and then integrating culturally based self-compassion interventions, looking at this more directly among racial minorities and sexual minorities. And something that I've been thinking about, like what's the best way to approach this, is this question I ask myself of, is there privilege in focusing on stigma with help seeking? Because that assumes in a way that the person can seek help. But there are so many issues with access to care, affordability, and also the anticipated competence. So, I remember working actually at the counseling center here, and working on the medical floor once a week and helping if there were, when they screen for depression or things like that, and they want to refer to therapy, or if emergencies come up related to, like, if a patient's having a panic attack, being there. But I remember there were sometimes students of color who didn't want to go to our counseling center because of how many white therapists we have. And I remember someone saying, I want a Black therapist, and I did therapy with the one Black therapist, and we weren't a good fit, which is totally fair. Like, that is a thing that happens. Are there any other Black therapists? Like, and like, yes, she has a 2-month wait list. No, and I, as much as I wanted her to get help, I also understood that lack of trust. And so I have also thought it'd be interesting to look at the anticipated stigma of the therapist that a person might perceive the therapist having towards them, look at the anticipated cultural humility, and seeing if that predicts help seeking above and beyond the stigma that we focus on so much. And so now this last part, that this is a newer area of research that I'm really excited about. And actually part of why I was excited to come here is that in presenting this, the idea was that then I could come here and the department would be able to give me some of the resources to do the work I want to do, which they are giving me those resources. So I'm really excited about this. But first, so why do we care about discrimination? So first, like, discrimination exists. So a quarter to like over half of adults in the United States experience discrimination in some form. And we also know that it negatively impacts health. And these are both meta-analyses, like I talked about earlier, where they looked at, I think when they looked at they studied existing studies. And also we know that sleep problems are common, and it might account for some of the disparities in physical health. So about a third of adults experience difficulties with sleep, and discrimination has been linked to worse sleep. And interestingly, about half of the differences, the study, I think it was white adults and Black adults with different levels of cardiovascular disease, when they accounted for sleep components of sleep, the differences reduced by about half, which indicates that sleep does play some role in these health disparities. And so putting all of these pieces together, there's this idea that discrimination is linked to worse sleep, and then worse sleep worsens health. And so I'm even going to take those words off. So essentially there's support for this, where they've looked at this with people of color, especially at one time point, but it hasn't been examined whether, like, causally, when we take a study, when we measure things at one time point, we kind of say we think these arrows go this way, but how do we actually know? We need to look at that longitudinally, and so we needed longitudinal support for this idea that discrimination impacts sleep, which then impacts health. And so then my colleague and I, I'll even just go right to here. So there was a publicly available data set called the MIDAS study. It was about 800 adults from the Midwest, and it was collected over about 9 years. And they collected mental health and physical health about 9 years apart, and then sleep in the middle, mental health, physical health, and discrimination. And so what we were able to do was really look at the change in those pieces over time while controlling for the mental health and physical health at the beginning, which was an even more stringent examination. So here are all these numbers. Let me make this a little more clear so you know what to look at. So that this idea that discrimination was linked to greater sleep disturbance. And even though these effects are relatively small, keep in mind that these were taken years apart, and they were still significant. So discrimination was linked to greater sleep disturbance, which was then linked to worse mental health and worse physical health. Now, in an ideal world, we would have been able to measure sleep and like all of these things, like at all of those 3 time points. We were working with what we had, but we still were controlling for a lot of like the beginning mental health, beginning physical health. And then we also found that discrimination still, even controlling for sleep disturbance, 9 years later, still predicted worse physical health. And again, the effect is small, but when you're looking at over that much time, the effects are going to be smaller. And also when we were thinking about, well, what does physical health mean? If you're looking at cardiovascular disease, then even a small effect has a big impact, especially when it's over the span of, thousands or millions of people. And then with the mental health, it was not statistically significant. It was marginally significant. So P was less than 0.1, but I even have hesitations about this. So this wasn't quite significant, which also then implied that the sleep made up for all of that. Or once we accounted for sleep, then that's where that discrimination impact on mental health largely went through. And so these numbers essentially just say that, yeah, we were able to also test, was this indirect path significant? And both of them were. And we also looked at like having multiple marginalized identities. So with this was any person could say that they were discriminated against for any number of identities, and they did report which ones. And so we looked at the number reported, and we did see a correlation with discrimination across time with sleep quality. Or this actually would not be sleep quality, this would be sleep disturbance, linked to greater sleep disturbance. And so there seems to be that the more marginal identity someone held, then it was linked to worse physical and mental health. So this provided the first causal support for this discrimination sleep to health model that researchers have tested in different components and different capacities. And so this could, because of those small, even though they were small, they were significant across such a big span of time, that kind of says, hey, there's something meaningful, like this is something we should be looking at, and also that multiple identities matter and should be considered in future research. Okay, so now zeroing in on then health disparities among LGBTQ folks. So we know that that sexual and minorities and gender diverse individuals experience worse mental and physical health than heterosexual and cisgender folks. And these disparities are even more pronounced for those who identify as trans and gender nonconforming or gender diverse, and also those with what we call non-monosexual identities. So there's also this whole other line of research that compares not just, sexual minorities to straight folks, but bisexual folks, pansexual, demisexual, non-monosexual, meaning people who are attracted or who are not just attracted to one gender. And the reason I don't say more than one is because we also have to account for asexual folks. And so what we see is that people who identify as non-monosexual tend to have even worse mental health than those who identify as gay or lesbian. And sleep within, this is looking at sleep with LGBTQ folks is a new or a much newer area, but a review in 2019 talked about that sleep being an unmet need. And so while a lot of the research that had been looked at before my colleague and I tested that model, it focused on people of color, largely Black individuals, which is very important because racial minorities, especially Black folks, face a lot of discrimination in this country. And so my hope is then to expand this into looking at sleep and sleep disparities with LGBTQ folks. And so in a paper I'm putting together now, we did test this model we were able to use a public data set with 781 folks who identified, actually I should update this because really it was LGBTQ. So folks, if someone identified as trans and heterosexual, then they weren't in that sample. Not because we want to exclude trans folks, but because don't want to put people in an umbrella that they're not. And also separately, we'll be focusing on trans and gender nonconforming individuals. But we did find this same pattern where discrimination was linked to greater sleep disturbance, which was linked to greater anxiety. And that indirect effect was significant. However, this is a public data set, so it was just a one-item measure of discrimination, and they can choose any number of identities. And unlike even the other study, we don't actually know what it was. It was what they were thinking of. It's just, have you been discriminated against for any of these things? Like, to what extent have you? And so going forward, I want to look at discrimination specific to the queer community. So right now, actually, we have a study that the IRB is in the process of hopefully approving. We're going to collect data looking at the relationships between heterosexism, sleep, and health, both mental health and physical health. And so we also want to look at the unique impact of identity-specific discrimination above and beyond heterosexism. So in this study we're hoping to run over summer, we're collecting 3 samples, and then there's a 4th study that we're collecting in a little bit different way. So we're going to submit that IRB separately, but we're going to look at just, do you identify as sexual minority? Then please participate, and they'll fill out measures related to this. But we also want to look at the unique impact of biphobia, because we know that there are these disparities even greater among non-monosexual folks. And so we have a measure that we're going to use and we're going to look at this with pansexual and bisexual individuals. And then also looking at a sexual minorities of color sample. So looking at the unique impacts of racism and heterosexism. And then another study is we want to look at the impact of transphobia for trans and gender diverse individuals. So that's a study that we're currently in the works of creating. And then some other questions that my lab hopes to answer is, can we interrupt this discrimination to sleep link? So decreasing discrimination, we all should work towards that. That's going to be really hard. And how can we help individuals respond to distress? And so one thing that we'll look at is self-compassion, to see if that then moderates or buffers that relationship. And so that's also in some of the data that we'll be collecting. We also will ask, why is discrimination linked to sleep? So for example, why is heterosexism linked to worse sleep? So one aspect, thinking of earlier when we talked about modified labeling theory, right? That public stigma to that self-stigma to then different outcomes. There's a minority stress model, which has a similar parallel, and it talks about having these external stressors linked to different proximal stressors, one of them being internalized stigma and that being linked to outcomes. And so then there's that question of, is part of why sleep is worse because there's some internalized stigma and that's distressing and that's making it more difficult to sleep. And so that's also in the data that we're collecting for those, we'll be collecting for those studies. And so we want to look at both, can self-compassion buffer the heterosexism to internalized stigma relationship? Thinking about this in a way as like the threat defense system, where we think of ourselves as the threat. And then also, could it help buffer the relationship with sleep? Oh, and something I realized, I think I might have accidentally skipped over it earlier, is a study that I published this last year, looked at, um, essentially, I said, okay, within help seeking, there's this focus on interrupting this internalization process, but we know it's really hard to decrease or prevent internalization. We'll look to see if we can, but it's hard. Self-stigma, internalized stigma is really salient. And so I propose this idea that, okay, we want to decrease self-stigma, but also can we help increase help seeking even when people have high self-stigma? And so we found that if you increase people's psychological flexibility or their openness, or really their openness to experiencing unpleasant emotions, that the relationship between self-stigma of seeking help and intention to seek help if they're experiencing distress became non-significant. And so then that put this idea of like, okay, let's figure out how to decrease the self-stigma, but also let's get people who have self-stigma in the door. And so self-compassion is one thing that could potentially help increase emotional openness. And so wanting to see, does that potentially parallel, not 100% because the sleep has less intention to it, but can that somehow weaken the impact of this other type of self-stigma, this other type of internalized stigma? So my hope is to run those studies that I mentioned to then build a grant appeal so I can get funding to run some really cool studies. I want to look at this longitudinally and collect it over time to see how discrimination and sleep and health are related over time, but then also looking at short-term impacts. So there are these things called daily diary studies where you get where people every day respond to measures. And so then you can actually see day to day, how does the discrimination that someone experiences impact their sleep? How does their sleep, and then how does that impact their mental health and their physical health? And what I'm really excited about that I have funding for from the department is to get essentially fancy Fitbits and expensive fancy Fitbits that are marvelous to look at sleep. So a lot of studies will use self-report measures, and there are some that are really well validated, but ultimately it would be great to get different measures of different aspects of sleep, because as the field moves forward with sleep, this idea of an overall sleep quality, just like with self-compassion, the idea that sleep quality is a one factor construct, that's actually being challenged. And so then we can look at different aspects of sleep, like how many times do you wake up in the middle of the night? How long do you sleep? And then also so right now, some of my research is focusing on looking at like general measures of sleep, but looking at specific things, just like how past studies had looked at, for example, cardiovascular health. So again, my research program looks at how does the world treat us? How do we respond? And then taking those pieces together and asking, okay, how does this relate to health disparities and how can we reduce it? And that's what I got. So what questions can I answer? Thanks, Kaylee. I like the virtual reaction.
First, I just want to say thank you so much for coming and talking for PsyChi. I think your research is awesome, and I think it gives. I'm not sure about everyone else, but it gives me hope that you see a lot of research where it's like it's all just done on cisgender white males, and when are we finally going to get the research on other people in the world? So I think it's just gives me a lot of hope that it's being done, and it's happening soon, and yeah, and right now I guess too. So thank you.
Yeah, I definitely agree with saying like you're even hearing the word like bisexual or pansexual or gender nonconforming like in a research context is something really foreign for me, even though like I try to when I get the chance, I like to focus on things like that when I'm doing research. So it's exciting to actually have more to look into that focuses on everyone.
Thanks. I'm glad to hear that. It's like it's because when I was in grad school, was also when I became more empowered in my identity and actually thought, oh, I can, do this research. And it's also easier to study straight people because there are more of them. And, it's even though it can take more time to do this work, I really appreciate it's nice to hear and be reminded of like, how much this matters, even though I know that, and even sadly this week I was talking with my RA about a discrimination experience that someone in their family had. And that's that connection of like, yeah, like that's why we're doing this work that we're doing, And so I'm hoping more people across all identities can be represented in this work.
I love the idea of tying in the sleep stuff, because sleep is so important to our mental health. And I thought the Fitbit thing was cool because I have a Fitbit, and that's why I got one, was to kind of look at my sleep. So, I've got 3 years of Fitbit records if y'all want some of them.
Send you an email. Yeah, that was in grad school. Like I love having a Fitbit and seeing and just seeing like the link to my mood with sleep. I don't know if you have found that, like that there's like a certain like sweet spot where you're like, okay, when I get this amount, then I am like good to go. And when it's less than that, it's like bad news.
Dr. Brenner, you mentioned some people with certain identities who have that stigma of pursuing help or mental health professionals. What are your thoughts? Like how do you think we can bridge that gap and get help to those who need it, or really encourage that for them, I guess?
Yeah, I think that especially with close others, when we have trouble validating our own worth because of a self-stigma being so high, oftentimes having acceptance or unconditional positive regard, Emily recognizes from my class, those terms, that can go a really long way. And so I think, if you're asking just what can we do with the people in our lives, I think, bringing up seeking help and talking about it in such a normalized way, allowing space for vulnerability, because there's and it can be different for some people. Is it that there's something, this view that there's something wrong with me, but oftentimes people feel inadequate or weak for seeking help. And so I think if we can reframe that as a sign of strength, which it is, therapy is not easy. And so one thing actually that they'll do with like folks in like veterans are reframing that as a sign of strength. But I think ultimately just having those direct conversations and telling, and you can like ask like, well, what's holding you back? And I think, to the extent that we feel comfortable disclosing that we seek therapy or have sought therapy, and normalizing that can go a long way too. But I don't know, what do you think, Zane? What others think?
Yeah, I think those are great thoughts. I don't know. I mean, it's such a hard thing, because if you're, set in your ways or feel like you are not able to do that, I feel like it's just one of those things where you don't want to push someone to do something that they don't want to do, and then it just doesn't end well or something like that. Or um yeah, I think just I like the reframing thing of just making it more acceptable, and saying those things of mental health is health. You go to the gym, so you also have to take your mind to the gym and challenge it and make sure it's healthy as well. So I don't know, those have always stuck out to me, and I like those. But I'm curious what maybe anyone else has to say.
I think, Zane, kind of going off what you were saying about people wanting to go in the first place is like one of the most frustrating things I've kind of had to grasp, like as a clinical counseling student, is like therapy won't work unless the person is open and willing to be there. When a lot of the times the case is like the people that really don't want to be there are probably the people that really need to be there. And it's always been like so hard to grapple with that, like as a student and as someone that wants to go into this. And so what you were saying, both of you, I think, about just making it the norm, is important for a lot of things, but therapy especially, just being able to like bring it up and not have it be a taboo thing to mention, because a lot of people feel like they can't talk about it or it means something about them if they bring it up. I think it's important to be able to bring it up in like a more casual context.
I'm from Russia, and the culture there is very much so like you mentioned, like bringing shame to your family if you seek out help, especially for mental health issues. And so I've been struggling with that almost my entire life. And I guess just like raising awareness for it and stuff like this, where you actually mention people who go through that really helps, because makes me feel like I'm not alone. And just like adapting to American culture, where I guess like everybody is individualistic, is very much so. It just becomes easier when you look at other people who share stuff like this. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your experience too. Like that, I couldn't put myself in your shoes really of like what that would be like to have that extra strong layer of what that means, and what, norms and messages you've been given of if you seek help, like that's what this is. And I appreciate you for sharing that.
One thing I'm kind of curious about, I'm curious what you think about this, Dr. Brenner. Kind of relates, also kind of maybe goes into another topic, but the whole idea of normalizing things that we've been talking about, like one area where I feel like a lot of people can like gain reassurance as far as mental health is social media. And a lot of people, will talk about their experiences going to therapy or talk about how normal it is. But then on the flip side of that, like one trend I've seen on social media is people like self-diagnosing or being like, oh, I have ADHD or I have this, and so I have X, Y, and Z symptoms. And then a bunch of people coming in and being like, oh my God, I didn't know I had ADHD because this TikTok is telling me I do. And so like on one hand, it's like reaffirming to go online and see people going through similar things to you. But then on the other hand, especially with the pandemic, I have been hearing about a lot of people's experiences, like just constantly being online and all of a sudden, oh my God, I have all these mental illnesses I didn't know I had because the internet told me I did. And so I think there's like an interesting dichotomy when it comes to social media and mental health. And I'm like curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I have a lot of feelings on it and some thoughts, mostly just like anger, but and frustration. But like, it's so frustrating. It's part of why I wish that more mental health professionals and academics would be on TikTok, because that's where I see a lot of that. And I am concerned about the self-diagnosis that takes place, and there's like a tendency. I actually saw a funny TikTok that was like pretty much like something about like saying whatever Gen Z, and it's like everything is either like because of your family trauma or because of your ADHD, or I forget, or because you're on the spectrum. And that really summarizes so many of TikToks that I've seen. And even, yeah, I get worried because there are also things. So one, we're all under a lot of stress, and ADHD symptoms can show up, as a result of anxiety, as a result of depression. That's why when part of the diagnosing someone with ADHD is you have to rule out all these other potential causes of the same symptoms. And I also get worried that people will have other things being missed. Like there's a pathologizing of different things, like people now talk about maladaptive daydreaming, and it's like, all right, you just space out and it's just a coping strategy, and that works for some people. Great, okay, fine. Or even then intrusive thoughts, which can also are a normal thing. And then there's a certain point where actually that could be OCD when it gets so distressing. And I see certain things where people will be like, oh, I found out that I have intrusive thoughts. And it's like, no, that's not a diagnosis, that's a symptom, or it's just something you're experiencing. And also if you're having intrusive thoughts about like stabbing someone who not like an actual I want to do that, or if you're having like taboo sexual thoughts, which are like about like people who who you don't actually feel attraction towards. Like those are signs of OCD, which can be so distressing and often requires medication to treat. Anyway, so as you can see, I feel really fired up about it, and I feel concerned. And I also wonder about, in general, as like a side note, I am concerned about, and by the way, I really respect Gen Z. I think you all are getting right what, oh, why is my alarm going off? What millennials, I think you're the generation that we wanted to be. But I am worried about like a potential rejection of science, even when I see this like astrology stuff growing, like, oh yeah, you're having these problems because you're a Virgo, or I don't know, apparently now Geminis are a problem. I don't know, but like this is, yeah. So, you know, I am concerned, and I think that we need to be, as a like scientists, and not that there's not room for intuition or those pieces, because those are also like tools that we have and have evolved for millions of, or thousands, whatever, of years. But I think that professionals and academics, I think, need to be intentional about seeing where these messages being spread. And as I'm ranting in response to your point, your question, Emily, it's making me feel more charged up of, okay, I should probably start making content that addresses this, and encouraging other academics to go on TikTok, because right now there's this thing of like, you know, oh, it's just people dancing, or oh, it's this silly thing, but it's not. It's a brilliant platform, and it's something that like you all are using. And I don't know, what do you think? Like, what do you think we could do?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of your points. I think for me, it's like a line almost that a lot of young people are like struggling to find, of like finding good information online, but then also going too far with it. And I know that like if I'm already like in a vulnerable place because of my anxiety, it's like not a good place for me to go to, because then I think that like things are worse than they really are because of whatever people are telling me online. But also it is, you know, kind of like what maybe Twitter used to be, or Facebook, or even Instagram used to be. Like it is a great way to get information so quickly. And like there's academics I follow on there that talk about like how to do grad school applications, or like what your resume should look at. And like for me, that's such like an amazing and an efficient way to get that information. And so I think it'd be great if, you know, there was a wider variety of people on there. And I like what you were saying about like people not taking it seriously, because like I think it's a great way, for me at least in the last year, to like hear people's experiences that I maybe wouldn't hear, like living in Fort Collins, Colorado, especially like over the summer when the BLM movement was gaining traction. Like there was a lot of experiences I got to hear about through that app that like I definitely probably wouldn't have been able to hear about living where I live and like going to school where I do. And so I do think that people can take it more seriously, because for me at least, like it's definitely been a good avenue for information. But also then on the flip side, it's important to tell what is not good information also.
Yeah, and I like the point you made of like that that people go to these places looking for information. And something, it reminds me of something that I'll think about sometimes when I cool down after seeing this information, is that this is a result of the fact that people who are on this app and are watching these videos are not actually getting the information that they need elsewhere. And to me, that responsibility, in addition to falling on social media apps for like figuring out how to deal with this misinformation mess, is also on us as mental health professionals, as us on educators. And why don't, you know, people on TikTok, and not just TikTok, it's just that information, you know, travels so fast. Instagram, Facebook, why don't people have this understanding of mental health, have access to this information? And so that's one way that I'm, you know, really, I think that we could do a lot better. And I agree. I think during like when BLM was increasing, I was bookmarking videos all the time, because I was just like, it, yeah, you know, really gets a lot of great information out.
Any other questions for Dr. Brenner before we wrap up? Awesome. Well, thank you. I think that was a wonderful discussion. I agree with you, Dr. Brenner. I think if we can just encourage academics to, you know, spread correct information. I know there's a psychology professor, Dr. Ina.
Ina.
Yes, yes.
There's probably Dr. Ina, yep.
Yeah, she directly responds to a lot of, false claims that it's like signs that you have this, and she'll say, okay, this wasn't backed in research, this. So I really appreciate her, because it's just so helpful to have like, wait a minute, like what you're seeing is not always true or correct. So yeah, I appreciate that. Before we conclude, Jaden, our Psychi Vice President, is going to take a screenshot. If you are wanting and willing to have your camera on for this photo, it'll go on our Instagram as well as our Facebook. So Jaden, you just count down and let us know when you're screenshotting. If you're comfortable to have your camera on, feel free to have it on. If not, feel free to have it off.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Okay, we will do it in about 3 seconds so my red face can go down a bit. Okay. 3, 2, 1. I got a lot, so that's great. Thank you guys.
Awesome. Thanks, Jaden. And thank you again, Dr. Brenner. We really appreciate having you come talk for Psychi and PSA today. A lot of great information that you were able to provide for us.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for the great discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Really,
Absolutely.
It's really interesting.
I'm so sorry, I keep cutting everyone off. Really quickly before we wrap up, also, we have elections being held next week. So I know that a lot of us are aware of this because a lot of the people in this call are running. However, if you are a member and you are not running, we have all of the positions and everyone running for them up on our website. So please go check those out. And then voting is opening Monday at 5 a.m., I believe. And will be open until that Friday evening next week. So please go check out the candidates. It's important to vote if you guys are involved with us. So that's it.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Emily.
everybody. Have a good night.
You too.